Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Apocrypha. Talk about the name, what's in a name? The Apocrypha, the term itself refers to those books that are hidden away. Apo is a compound word. Apo and Kryphe, a cipher is something that's like a hidden writing, and then apo is just the prefix from. But these books aren't really hidden, and we're going to take away some of the mystery in this class. Uh, they've also been referred to as the deuterocanonical. That's not a term that I particularly like because remember, a duo is like a second something, two people doing something, and this describes them as a second canon. And here I take issue with it because I don't think they're necessarily canonical. I'm not putting them down. I'm not saying there's anything bad about them, but when we refer to those books that are canonical, we're talking about those books that have authority. Josephus, the first century historian, gives us the Jewish idea behind these books. Remember, they were Jewish books. And he says how we have not an innumerable multitude of books among us, disagreeing from and contradicting one another as the Greeks have, but only 22 books. Now, when he refers to the 22 books, he's referring to what we call the Old Testament, though they counted them different. You say, wait a minute, there are 39 books in our Old Testament. Not the way the Jewish people count them, because they take books like the minor prophets, they count that as one book. They refer to it as the 12. And then First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles, that's counted as one book. Or First and Second Samuel, that's one book. Ezra and Nehemiah are counted together. So he's talking about the same books when he refers to the 22 books, which contain the records of all the past times, which are justly believed to be divine. That is, Josephus says the Jewish people think those books are from God. He goes on to say, it is true our history has been written since Artaxerxes very particularly, or very peculiarly, but has not been esteemed of the like authority with the former by our forefathers, because there has not been an exact succession of prophets since that time. Now, he's talking here about the books that we refer to as the Apocrypha, but he says they don't have the same authority because they didn't come from prophets. Now, what are these books? Let's look at them. First of all, we have, and notice I've assigned them into 6 different groupings. There are those that are historical, like First Esdras and First and Second Maccabees. Secondly, there are those that are, we could call them moralistic novels. Tobit, Judas, Susanna, Bel and the Dragon. Third and Fourth Maccabees, I'm not even sure if I necessarily put them into that category. They're sort of hard to place. They're not of the same caliber or even the same type, really, as First and Second Maccabees. Thirdly, there are the wisdom literature, Wisdom of Solomon and Ecclesiasticus, also called the Wisdom of Sirach, which contain lots of proverbs and wise sayings. There is devotional literature, such as Barak and the Prayer of Manasseh, Prayer of Azariah. In that sense, it reminds us a little bit of the Psalms, but that might be saying too much. There's apocalyptic literature, Second Esdras, and finally there are those additions to other books, more chapters that are given to Esther, sort of might want to call it a sequel, or filling in what somebody thought were maybe the blanks. I don't think they were. Additions to Daniel, a letter of Jeremiah, and an additional Psalm 151. When you read Psalm 151, I think it's very different from all of the Psalms that come before. It's not quite on the same level. That's not to say anything bad about it, but it's not scripture. And when you read it, you can see why the Jews thought this was the case. Let's talk about the content of some of these. We're not going to go through every one of them, but First Esdras, the title is the Greek way of saying Ezra. So you have the book of Ezra, but then you have this other book of Ezra. It's found in the Septuagint, that is, it's written in Greek, and it follows the narrative of Second Chronicles. It actually gives a retelling of a lot of Second Chronicles, of Ezra, and the last part of Nehemiah. And so here's the outline for it. It begins back in the days of the Chronicles with Josiah and his sons. That material is covered at the end of Second Kings and at the end of Second Chronicles. Then Cyrus, remember in Cyrus is the Persian ruler who has overthrown Babylon, and he gives permission for the Jews to go and to rebuild their temples and their cities. And when they go back in chapter 2, verse 16, the rebuilding is opposed by Artaxerxes, and suddenly you've jumped a bunch of kings to go from Cyrus to Artaxerxes. And there's a feast that is involved in a contest of 3 bodyguards back in Persia. And Darius, who now comes on the scene, by the way, notice the Artaxerxes there probably is Cambyses, the son of Cyrus. Darius, the next king, the 3rd king in line, vows to rebuild the temple, and the returnees are listed, and they have the Feast of Tabernacles in the rebuilt temple. The rebuilding is opposed by people of the land, and the rebuilding resumes under the prophets, and Darius now gives permission. Notice you had permission given by Cyrus. Darius now giving permission, and now you have the ministry of Ezra, which follows pretty much the closing chapters of the book of Ezra. So what you have is a number of extra stories thrown in, and it's sort of a compilation of the stories that are found in those other books with some additional stories that are described. Now, the books of Maccabees, and we're going to talk about all 4 of the books of Maccabees, and the first Maccabees is the history of the Maccabean revolt. We're actually going to look in further detail in that against their Seleucid. Those are Greeks that had taken over Syria. Their Seleucid masters, and it covers the period from 175 to 134 BC. And some very good history. I'm not saying it's necessarily ordained from God, but it's telling some excellent history, and it's quite good. Second Maccabees actually goes back and starts with Jeremiah, just tells some stories in the first couple of chapters, and then gives the career of Judas the Maccabee, but doesn't continue with the other brothers of Judas who followed him after his death. So it goes back earlier and then comes up. But in that, it sort of tells at least portions of the same stories. And in that, I've likened First and Second Maccabees a little bit to how we have 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, telling at least parts of the same story. You say, well, Luke gives more of the birth narrative, and then John tells some things that Matthew and Mark and Luke don't tell. So it's a little bit like that, and maybe that's saying too much. Third Maccabees gives us the adventures of the Jews living in Egypt during the time of the Ptolemies. It doesn't really even talk about what's going on in Jerusalem. And then Fourth Maccabees is a discourse on the value of reason illustrated by those Jewish martyrs who lived in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes. And so it does mention some of those who were killed in that earlier story. But they're not quite so historical. It's really more of a lecture on different value systems. Now, First Maccabees begins, I want to give you a good outline for First Maccabees. It begins with a brief introduction, and then you go back to Alexander the Great and how those kings came about, and the generals of Alexander divided up the land. And so now you have the Seleucids, and one of the Seleucids is Antiochus the Fourth. He's not called the Fourth. Antiochus, he calls himself Epiphanes, although the Jews called him Antiochus Epimanes. And Antiochus captures Jerusalem, and that's all in the first chapter. And then the story of the revolt is in chapter 2, where he has listed all of these reasons why the Jews are going to become good Greeks now. They're going to give up their gods. And there is a revolt that takes place in the little town of Modin, led by an elderly priest, Matthias, and his 7 sons. The chief one, he's not the oldest, but the one who leads the revolt is Judas, and he's going to become the new leader. And so the career of Judas now is seen in chapters 3 through 9, where he leads them in the fight to retake Jerusalem. And then once they've captured it and cleansed the temple, things aren't over yet. The Greeks come with an army and then a second and a third. And so they have to defend the city of Jerusalem against these repeated attacks. And finally, at the end of that, Judas is actually killed. And then chapters 10 through 12 are Jonathan, his younger brother, as the leader, and then a second brother, Simon, the high priest and ethnarch, and that closes up First Maccabees. Now, Second Maccabees, like we said, roughly covers the same material, at least of chapters 1 through 9, although it starts earlier, and then it follows Judas, but it doesn't follow these others who come later. Here's a segment that we want to look at from Second Maccabees that I think you'll find interesting. In chapter 2, it says, one finds in the records that the prophet Jeremiah ordered those who were being deported to take some of the fire, as had been mentioned, and that the prophet, after giving them the law, instructed those who were being deported not to forget the commandments of the Lord or to be led astray in their thoughts on seeing the gold and the silver statues and their adornment. And with other similar words, he exhorted them that the law should not depart from their hearts. Now, that you can probably see elements of that, perhaps in the book of Jeremiah. However, we continue, verse 4, and it was also in the same document that the prophet, having received an oracle, ordered that the tent and the ark should follow with him, and that he went out to the mountain where Moses had gone up and had seen the inheritance of God. Now, that mountain where Moses had gone up, that was on the east side of the Jordan River in the country today we call the country of Jordan, on Mount Pisgah. And notice what he's saying, the tabernacle and the ark would be taken there. Verse 5, Jeremiah came and found a cave dwelling, and he brought there the tent and the ark and the altar of incense. These he sealed up then he sealed up the entrance. Some of those who followed him came up intending to mark the way, but could not find it. When Jeremiah learned of it, he rebuked them and declared, the place shall remain unknown until God gathers his people together again and shows his mercy. Then the Lord will disclose these things, and the glory of the Lord and the clouds will appear. And they were shown in the case of as they were shown in the case of Moses, and as Solomon asked that the place should be especially consecrated. Now, what he's saying is that the Ark of the Covenant was hidden away, but that it would be brought out when they came back. Well, they came back. It was never brought out. The ark never shows up in history again. Next, we want to look at the wisdom of Sirach. The titles for this book, it's called Sirach. It's also called The Wisdom of Yeshua ben Sirah. It's also called Ecclesiasticus, and that's perhaps the title. Now, that's not to be confused with Ecclesiastes. That's a different book entirely. This book is written in Hebrew, but then it was translated into Greek by his son in Alexandria. So we have, I believe we've actually found copies that were in Hebrew, especially I think there may have been one with the Dead Sea Scrolls. But then most of the copies that we have are the Greek copies. And it consists of a collection of Proverbs, and they're wise sayings. You know how we have not just the book of Proverbs, but we have wise sayings, for example, that were collected by Benjamin Franklin. And there's some wisdom there, and they're good things. I wouldn't put them down. The wisdom of Sirach, then, for 51 chapters, the first couple of chapters are talking about the need for wisdom, and the third Lord reminds us of quite a bit of the Proverbs. Perhaps some same ideas are borrowed from that. The central part of the book are general proverbs on wise living in every area of life. Chapter 43 is an ode to creation as it reflects God's glory, and then the last few chapters give us a walk through some of the heroes of the faith and why they showed God's wisdom and they demonstrated the fear of the Lord. So again, some good writings. Here's the way it begins. Chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, all wisdom is from the Lord, and with him it remains forever. The sand of the sea, the drops of the rain, and the days of eternity, who can count them? The height of heaven, the breadth of the earth, the abyss, and wisdom, who can search them out? Wisdom was created before all other things, and prudent understanding from eternity. There is but one who is wise, I'm jumping down a few verses, greatly to be feared, seated upon his throne, the Lord. It is he who created her. Who's the her? Wisdom. It is he who created her. He saw her and took her measure. You say, well, why is it her? Because the Hebrew word for wisdom is actually a feminine word. So he saw her and took her measure. He poured her out upon his works, upon all the living according to his gift. He lavished her upon those who love him. The fear of the Lord is glory and exaltation and gladness and a crown of rejoicing. The fear of the Lord delights the heart and gives gladness and joy and long life. Those who fear the Lord will have a happy end. On the day of their death, they will be blessed. And finally, to fear the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. She is created with the faithful in the womb. She made among human beings an eternal foundation, and among their descendants she will abide faithfully. And so it's almost like an ode to wisdom. Again, reminds us a bit of the opening verses of the book of Proverbs. Now we jump down to some of the themes. Here's the theme on giving, Sirach, in chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. If you do good, know to whom you do it, and you will be thanked for your good deeds. Do good to the devout, and you will be repaid, if not by them, certainly by the Most High. No good comes to the one who persists in evil, or to one who does not give alms. And so, it's talking about giving, and that's a good thing. Although notice there is an interesting digression from from the giving passages that we see in the Proverbs. Do you notice it? It's giving to those who do good, to those who are the deserving. Let's look and see more of those. In verse 4, give to the devout, but do not help the sinner. Do good to the humble, but do not give to the ungodly. Remember how different this is from what Jesus says when he says, give even to those who are your enemies. And so he says, hold back their bread. Do not give it to them, for by means of it they might subdue you. Then you will receive twice as much evil for all the good that you have done to them. Quite a difference between this versus the passages that we see about giving in the scriptures. He goes on, for the Most High also hates sinners and will inflict punishment on the ungodly. Give to the one who is good, but do not help the sinner. Now, here's some things that are said about slaves. Fodder and a stick and burdens for a donkey, bread and discipline, and work for a slave. Now, that's interesting. I think that you do find things about slavery and servants in the scriptures, but not quite to this degree of harshness and hostility. Verse 26, set your slave to work and you will find rest. Leave his hands idle and he will seek liberty. Make sure he works all the time so that he doesn't try to escape. Yoke and thong will bow the neck. And for a wicked slave, there are racks and tortures. We don't see that kind of language in the pages of the Bible. Verse 28, put him to work in order that he may not be idle, for idleness teaches much evil. Verse 30, set him to work as it is fitting for him, and if he does not obey, make his fetters heavy. Do not be overbearing toward anyone, and do nothing unjust. So there is a limit that they're required to go, not too much so. Verse 31, if you have but one slave, treat him like yourself, because you have bought him with blood. If you have but one slave, treat him like a brother, for you will need him as you need your life. Now, it doesn't necessarily say the same thing if you've got a bunch of slaves. But if you've got one, verse 32, if you ill-treat him and he leaves you and runs away, which way will you go to seek him? You're going to lose your money is the idea behind that. Subjects on death. O death, how bitter is the thought of you to the one at peace among possessions, who has nothing to worry about and is prosperous in everything and still is vigorous enough to enjoy food. There's times when you die and you don't want to die. I'm still enjoying life. And that's the idea to which the writer is pointing. O death, how welcome is your sentence to one who is needy and failing in strength, worn down by age and anxious about everything, to one who is contrary and has lost all patience. There are some, according to the writer, for whom death is a welcome release. And so he says, do not fear death's decree for you. Remember those who went before you and those who will come after. You have a long line, and we close on this note. This is the Lord's decree for all flesh. Why then should you reject the will of the Most High? Whether life lasts for 10 years or 100 or 1,000, there are no questions asked in Hades. Hades is the land of the dead. Notice there's no hint of a life after death, not in Sirach. This is all you get, and so make the most of it, and don't worry about it. When it comes, it will all be over. A very different picture, even in books like Ecclesiastes and the Psalms, a very different picture where there are these subtle hints that even at death, there's more to the story. Judgment remains. That's how Ecclesiastes ends.